An aging elephant, withdrawn and fragile after years of relocation. A compassionate veterinarian, returning to a familiar place, unsure of the bond still intact. The elephant refuses to eat, sinking deeper into despair as the staff grows increasingly concerned. A familiar voice, a memory from the past, stirs something deep within, sparking hope for both. Rajan, a 59-year-old elephant, stood in the corner of his enclosure at the new zoo, his large, wrinkled body a testament to the many years he had lived. His skin, a dull gray, was now sagging slightly with age, the once robust muscles under it no longer as firm as they had been in his youth. His tusks, long and curved, had grown dull with time, but they still held a certain majesty. His eyes, however, were what seemed most different. Once full of curiosity and a playful spark, they now seemed distant, clouded with sadness and weariness. Rajan had been relocated to this zoo from another years ago. In his prime, he had roamed freely in wide, open spaces, his towering presence admired by visitors. But now in the confines of his new home, something was different. The zookeepers and staff noticed his behavior becoming more withdrawn. He refused to eat, something unheard of for an elephant his age. His appetite had always been hearty, and Rajan had been known for his large meals and playful interactions with the staff. But now his meals sat untouched, his once hungry eyes showing little interest in the food. The zookeepers, initially hopeful that this was just a temporary phase, grew concerned as the days passed. The food, carefully prepared and offered in the same loving manner, was ignored. Rajan simply stood there, staring off into the distance, his mind seemingly somewhere else. His lethargy became more pronounced. He would spend entire days lying in his corner, his vast body unmoving, save for the occasional twitch of his large ears or the gentle swaying of his trunk. The usual energy that he once had was nowhere to be seen. Staff tried everything they could think of, different types of food, changing his environment, offering new companions for him to interact with, but nothing worked. He wasn't sick in the traditional sense. His physical health seemed fine, but his spirit appeared broken. The veterinary staff was consulted, and after a few tests, they found no physical ailments. Rajan was not suffering from any obvious illnesses, yet his refusal to eat, his deepening withdrawal, and his increasingly listless nature suggested something else, something more profound. The team, which had seen many animals come and go over the years, began to suspect that Rajan's troubles might stem from emotional distress rather than a simple physical illness. Rajan's past had been filled with significant change. For the first 15 years of his life, he had been cared for by the same veterinarian, Dr. Ananya, at the zoo where he was born. He had grown up there, and there he had formed strong bonds with his caretakers, particularly with Dr. Ananya. But eventually, Rajan had been moved to this new zoo, and that's when things began to change. The memories of his original home, the open spaces, the familiar faces, the routine he had once known, seemed to have faded into the background. The adjustment to the new zoo was a difficult one, and perhaps in the quiet corners of his mind, Rajan felt lost, abandoned, and displaced. The staff couldn't help but wonder if it wasn't just physical ailment that had taken Rajan's spirit, but the emotional toll of separation. Animals, after all, were not unlike humans in their need for familiar faces and environments, and Rajan's refusal to eat seemed to reflect a profound sadness, perhaps a longing for the life he had left behind. Dr. Ananya had spent years of her life caring for animals, but none had left such a lasting impact on her as Rajan, the young elephant she had nurtured for 15 years. She had first met him when he was just a calf, full of curiosity and boundless energy. Dr. Ananya, a compassionate and patient veterinarian, had formed a special bond with Rajan during those early years, tending to his every need with a sense of duty and care that went beyond professionalism. She had been there for his first steps, his playful antics, and even the first time he had interacted with the other elephants. Those years were full of laughter and warmth, with Rajan becoming a central part of her life. When Rajan had been moved to the new zoo, Dr. Ananya had felt a deep pang of loss. It was difficult to let go of the animal she had watched grow into a magnificent creature, but she understood that this was part of his journey. She continued her work at other zoos, always carrying the memories of Rajan with her. But now, years later, as she received the call about Rajan's decline, she felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. Her heart tugged at the thought of him, of the elephant who had once recognized her every voice and gesture. At first, Dr. Ananya was reluctant to return. She had moved on with her career and had built a new life in another city. But the thought of Rajan, an animal she had cared for deeply, struggling in his later years, weighed heavily on her heart. She knew that returning was not just a professional duty, but a personal one. She had to try, if not for his physical health, then for his emotional well-being. Arriving at the zoo, Dr. Ananya was greeted by a mixture of hope and desperation from the staff. They led her to Rajan's enclosure, where he stood alone in a corner, distant and unmoving. The moment she laid eyes on him, her heart ached. Rajan's once bright eyes were now dull, his energy gone, and the spirit that had once defined him seemed to have faded away. But as she approached the enclosure, Dr. Ananya's voice softened, instinctively calling his name.
Rajan, it's me.
She murmured almost to herself. The sound of her voice carried across the enclosure, a gentle ripple in the stillness of the air. For a moment, there was no response. Rajan stood motionless, his head lowered slightly, as though unsure of what to make of the familiar sound. But then, just as Dr. Ananya took a cautious step forward, she saw it. His large ears twitched. It was subtle but undeniable. Rajan's trunk slowly lifted, his nostrils flaring slightly as he sniffed the air. Dr. Ananya's heart skipped a beat. She took another step forward, her eyes meeting his, unsure of what his reaction would be. He was a large, formidable creature, yet in that moment, she saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the same vulnerability she had seen in him as a young calf. Her voice wavered with emotion as she spoke again, this time louder and clearer.
Rajan, do you remember me?
Rajan's ears twitched once more, and then, almost as if something within him recognized her, he lifted his head. His eyes locked onto hers, and in that instant, Dr. Ananya felt the world stand still. There was a quiet recognition in his gaze, a flicker of the playful, curious elephant she had known all those years ago. The tension in the air was palpable. She held her breath, hoping that the connection would rekindle, even after all this time. Rajan's trunk began to move slowly, reaching out towards her. It wasn't the playful, mischievous reach of his younger days, but it was something, an acknowledgement, a sign that he remembered. Dr. Ananya, trembling with emotion, took a careful step forward, her voice soft and steady as she spoke once more.
It's me, Rajan. It's Dr. Ananya.
For a long moment, neither of them moved. The zoo was silent, the staff watching in awe. Dr. Ananya's heart was pounding, but she didn't want to rush him. Rajan's reaction was so subtle, so tentative, that she knew she had to approach carefully, allowing him the time he needed to process the familiarity of her voice. She took one more step, extending her hand toward the enclosure, hoping he would come closer. Rajan's trunk gently reached out, brushing against the bars of the enclosure. His response was slow but deliberate, and as it touched the bars where Dr. Ananya stood, a quiet peace seemed to settle over him. There was a stillness in the air, a recognition between them that spoke volumes. Dr. Ananya smiled, her heart swelling with relief and hope. The bond that had never truly left, though buried under years of separation, was beginning to resurface. The reunion was tentative, uncertain, but it held the promise of something profound, something healing. Rajan had recognized her, and in that moment, both of them understood that they were not alone. Rajan stood still as Dr. Ananya spoke softly to him, her voice a gentle presence in the quiet of the zoo. His response at first was hesitant. He remained in his corner, his large body still and unmoving, except for the occasional flicker of his ears. But as she spoke again, her voice steady and familiar, something within him seemed to stir. His ears twitched. It was subtle, a small movement that only those who knew him well would recognize. Dr. Ananya's heart skipped at the sight. She had always known that Rajan's intelligence and sensitivity would make him respond to the familiar, but seeing it in action after all these years filled her with hope. She took a step closer, her voice soothing as she spoke to him about their past.
Do you remember the time we went on that walk together in the early mornings?
she asked gently, recalling the small things they used to share, the walks, the games, the moments of quiet companionship.
You were always so curious, Rajan. You used to love exploring.
As she spoke, Rajan's trunk slowly lifted, his nostrils flaring as if searching for her scent. He didn't move from his spot, but his eyes softened, and his gaze seemed to focus on her for the first time in what felt like ages. It was as though her words had unlocked something deep inside him, a long-forgotten connection to the past. His trunk extended slightly, brushing against the bars of the enclosure, a tentative but unmistakable sign of recognition. Dr. Ananya smiled, her voice full of tenderness as she continued.
You always knew when I was near, didn't you? You'd come right up to me with your trunk outstretched, just like this.
Rajan's ears flicked again, this time more distinctly. His body was still heavy with age, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. He lifted his head slightly, as though considering her words. There was a long pause, the air between them thick with the weight of their shared history. For a brief moment, time seemed to stretch. And then, very slowly, Rajan turned his head toward Dr. Ananya, his gaze locking onto hers with a quiet intensity. The connection was fragile, but it was there. Dr. Ananya's heart warmed as she stood still, waiting for Rajan to process the familiarity of her voice, the comfort of her presence. She didn't rush him. She simply spoke of the past, of the years they had spent together, and of the moments that had meant so much to both of them. Over the next few days, Dr. Ananya returned to Rajan's enclosure, each visit filled with the same quiet anticipation. She continued to speak to him, using familiar tones, recounting the things they used to do. Slowly, Rajan began to respond more. The first time he took a step towards her, his large feet moving with a hesitant but deliberate pace, Dr. Ananya felt her heart leap. He was listening. He was hearing her, and slowly the barrier of distance and time seemed to be fading. Dr. Ananya began to speak to him in the same way she had when he was younger, calling him with the same command to come closer, the same gentle words to reassure him. She began to mimic the sounds he had once responded to, hoping to remind him of the familiar routines they had shared. Each time she returned, she was met with slightly more openness. Rajan's ears would flick with recognition, his trunk would extend towards her, and his eyes, those once dull eyes, began to shine with the faintest glimmer of life. On the fourth visit, Dr. Ananya brought a treat she knew Rajan had loved as a young elephant, a bundle of fresh bamboo. As she placed it near the fence, she spoke gently.
Do you remember this? You used to eat it all the time, Rajan. Bamboo, just like we used to share.
Rajan hesitated, his gaze shifting between the bamboo and Dr. Ananya. For a moment it seemed as though he might turn away again, but then his trunk moved toward the food. Tentatively, he nudged the bamboo, sniffing it with cautious curiosity. Dr. Ananya watched with bated breath, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't much, just a small movement, but it was a breakthrough. Rajan was showing interest. Over the next few days, the signs of transformation became more evident. Rajan would approach the food, sniff it, and even take a small bite. His appetite was still far from what it once was, but the change was undeniable. The zookeepers noticed his demeanor shift too. He was no longer as withdrawn. Though still slower and more cautious, Rajan was beginning to engage with his surroundings again. He started to spend more time standing, moving about his enclosure with a bit more energy, as though his body was waking up from a long slumber. Dr. Ananya continued her visits, her heart light with the progress she was witnessing. Each day she would speak to him, encouraging him with soft words and reminders of their shared history. The food, the walks, the games. Each story she told seemed to bring a piece of Rajan's former self back into the present. Slowly he began to trust her again, and with that trust came a renewed sense of hope. Rajan's reaction to Dr. Ananya's presence and voice was no longer hesitant. It was as if he had begun to remember who he was, and who she was to him. The bond that had once been so strong was returning, piece by piece, and with each visit, Rajan became more alive, more present, as though his soul was beginning to reawaken from the grief and confusion that had clouded it for so long. Dr. Ananya's daily visits to Rajan became a steady rhythm in both of their lives. Each morning she arrived at the zoo, her heart full of hope and a touch of nervousness, unsure of what kind of response she might receive. But each time she stepped into the enclosure, she was met with the same familiar gaze from Rajan, still cautious but now more alert. Her voice, calm and soothing, would fill the space between them as she spoke to him, sharing stories of their past, of the time they had spent together when he was young, and the small rituals they had once shared.
Do you remember the time we used to play in the water together?
She would ask, her voice filled with warmth.
You always loved splashing around in the pond, getting your feet wet. You were always so playful.
At first, Rajan would remain still, his large body unmoving. But then, as her words continued, his eyes would brighten just a little. His trunk would twitch, and his ears would flick. It was a small sign, but it was enough to encourage Dr. Ananya to keep going. With each passing day, she found new memories to share with him, gently bringing him back to the world he had once known. As the days passed, Rajan slowly began to respond to her voice in ways that were more noticeable. His ears flicked at the sound of her steps. His trunk would extend toward her, almost as if reaching out for the familiar comfort of her presence. Sometimes he would sway gently, as though reminiscing about the moments she described. The transformation was slow, but it was unmistakable. Dr. Ananya continued to speak to him, recounting moments they had shared. The mornings when he had run playfully in the field, the times she had soothed him during thunderstorms, and the countless hours spent together in quiet companionship. Each memory seemed to stir something inside Rajan. But the most important change was his increasing interest in food. At first, he had only shown small signs of curiosity, sniffing the bamboo and fruit she offered, but not touching it. But gradually he began to nibble, slowly at first, then more confidently. It was as if the act of eating was no longer a distant, overwhelming task, but something familiar, something that, like the memories Dr. Ananya shared, brought comfort in safety. As he regained his appetite, his energy began to return. Rajan started to stand for longer periods, moving around his enclosure with more purpose. His once sluggish movements became more deliberate. His eyes, which had once been clouded with confusion and sadness, now held a spark of life. Dr. Ananya could see the change each day. The once withdrawn, lethargic elephant was now more alert, more present in the world around him. His body was stronger, and though he was still moving slowly, there was a renewed sense of vitality in his every step. The zookeepers noticed the difference too. Rajan began to engage with them more, approaching them with curiosity and even offering his trunk for a gentle touch. Though still cautious, he was no longer the shadow of the elephant he had once been. The staff observed how, when he interacted with others, he always remained close to Dr. Ananya. He would often move toward her when she was nearby, seeking her presence in moments of uncertainty. She had become a grounding force for him, the one person who had given him a sense of security and trust. But it wasn't just Rajan's physical health that improved. His emotional state was shifting as well. In the moments when he grew uncertain, when a loud noise startled him, or when a new person approached, he would look to Dr. Ananya. She would speak to him softly, her voice a constant source of reassurance.
You're okay, Rajan. I'm here. You're safe.
She would say, her words a balm for the anxiety that sometimes lingered in his eyes. With her comfort, Rajan began to show trust in others once more. In the mornings, Rajan would venture closer to the other elephants, watching them interact. There was still a distance between him and them, but he wasn't as withdrawn as before. He would occasionally share the same space, content to observe. His relationship with the other elephants was tentative, but it was progress. Slowly, he was beginning to reconnect, not just with Dr. Ananya, but with the world around him. The joy of life, something that had seemed lost in his sorrow, was beginning to return. One afternoon, after several weeks of steady improvement, Dr. Ananya arrived at the zoo to find Rajan standing near the fence, his trunk reaching out toward the other elephants. He was still keeping a distance, but there was an unmistakable curiosity in his posture. As she approached, Rajan looked up, his large eyes meeting hers. For the first time in weeks, she saw a full, gentle sway of his body, as if he was acknowledging both her and the others. His trust in her had opened up the possibility for trust in others once more. Dr. Ananya stood for a moment, taking in the sight of Rajan. He was no longer the same elephant that had been withdrawn and listless when she first arrived. His body was stronger, his movements more confident, and his emotional state had shifted. There was a new light in his eyes, a light of hope, of healing, and of renewal. She approached him slowly, her heart swelling with pride at his progress.
You've done it, Rajan.
She whispered, running a gentle hand along the fence.
You found your way back.
Rajan turned his head toward her, and for a moment, their gazes locked. The bond between them had been rekindled, stronger now than it had ever been. He had come back to life, not just in body, but in spirit. And with Dr. Ananya's care and compassion, Rajan had found a way to heal, rediscovering the joy of living and the trust that had once defined him. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, there was hope in Rajan's eyes. The breakthrough came on a quiet morning, one that began like any other, yet held the promise of something profound. Dr. Ananya had arrived at the zoo earlier than usual, her steps steady but filled with anticipation. Rajan was already standing by the fence, his large frame silhouetted against the soft light of dawn. She could see the familiar flick of his ears, the way his trunk swayed slightly in the morning breeze. But there was something different today, a sense of openness in him that had not been present before. Dr. Ananya knew it was time to break through the final wall, the one that had kept Rajan distant from the world and from his past. She approached him slowly, her voice gentle but clear.
Rajan,
She began, her tone rich with warmth and nostalgia.
do you remember when we used to walk together by the lake? You were so strong, so curious. You'd always lead the way, exploring every new path, every new smell. You were never afraid to try something new.
As she spoke, Rajan's trunk moved slowly, almost as though he was reaching out to her words. He turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing in concentration. The memory she evoked seemed to resonate within him. His ears flicked again, and there was a shift in his posture. His body, which had once been sluggish and reluctant, now stood taller, more alert. But it was a moment during one of their daily visits that truly marked the turning point in Rajan's recovery. Dr. Ananya had brought with her a special meal, his favorite fruits and bamboo, just the way he liked it when he was younger. She had placed the food near him, as she had done many times before, but this time something was different. Rajan moved towards the meal without hesitation. His trunk reached out and touched the fruit, then slowly, deliberately, he took a bite. For a moment, Dr. Ananya stood frozen, watching with bated breath. Rajan had not eaten a full meal in weeks. His recovery had been slow, and though he had shown small signs of interest in food, this moment was different. It was more than just a physical act. It was a sign that he had come to trust in the process of healing, that he was beginning to embrace the nourishment not just for his body, but for his spirit. Rajan ate steadily, his movements more confident now. The zookeepers, who had gathered at a distance, watched in awe as Rajan devoured the food. His eyes, once distant and clouded with sorrow, were now soft with recognition and trust. There was a calmness in his demeanor, a peace that had not been present for so long. It was a moment of true healing, a moment where Rajan not only accepted the food, but seemed to welcome it as part of his journey back to life. Dr. Ananya moved closer, her heart swelling with pride and relief. She spoke to him softly as he ate, her voice a gentle hum in the quiet of the morning.
You're doing so well, Rajan.
She whispered.
I'm so proud of you.
The zoo staff, too, could see the change. They had watched Rajan struggle for so long, his condition deteriorating in silence, and now they were witnessing his rebirth. They exchanged glances of wonder and disbelief as Rajan continued to eat, his trunk moving with purpose and ease. It wasn't just the physical act of eating that had changed, it was the spirit behind it. Rajan was no longer the broken, withdrawn elephant they had first met. He was coming back into himself. Over the next few days, Rajan's improvement accelerated. He began taking longer walks around the zoo, exploring the spaces he had once known. His movements were still measured, but there was a confidence to them now. He spent time in the open spaces, moving with an ease he had not shown before. His relationship with the other elephants deepened as well. Though he still kept some distance, he was more social, more willing to engage. Rajan's recovery was not just a physical transformation, it was a full return to himself. His playful, curious nature had come back, and with it, his joy for life. He had rediscovered the world around him, and with Dr. Ananya's steady presence, he had regained the trust he had lost. It was a process that had taken time, patience, and immense care, but Rajan was whole again. The full meal Rajan had eaten that day, though a simple act, symbolized his emotional and physical healing. It marked the end of his struggle and the beginning of his new life. With every bite, Rajan not only nourished his body, but he also reaffirmed his place in the world. And in that moment, surrounded by the caring presence of Dr. Ananya and the zoo staff, Rajan knew that he had found his way back. Rajan's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. His once sluggish movements had transformed into graceful strides, his large frame now a testament to his renewed health and strength. The slow, hesitant steps he had taken during his early days of recovery were replaced by confident, deliberate movements. Rajan was back to his old self, playful, curious, and eager to engage with the world around him. Dr. Ananya, who had been by his side every step of the way, continued to visit him daily. Her presence was no longer just that of a caretaker. It had grown into something deeper, something more profound. The bond between them had strengthened over the weeks, and it was clear to everyone at the zoo that their connection was special. Rajan greeted her now with a raised trunk and a soft rumble of recognition, his eyes bright with trust and affection. He would follow her as she moved through the enclosure, occasionally reaching out with his trunk to nudge her gently, as if to say, "I remember you." The change in Rajan was evident to everyone. He was now eating regularly, devouring his meals with a healthy appetite. He had regained the energy that had once seemed lost forever. His playful nature had returned, and he was once again engaging with the zoo visitors, showing them his characteristic curiosity. Children laughed and waved as Rajan approached, his trunk reaching out to explore their scent or gently touch the bars of the enclosure. He was no longer the withdrawn, distant elephant that had arrived at the zoo months ago. His joy for life was evident in every movement, every interaction. One of the zookeepers, Maria, who had spent countless hours with Rajan during his lowest moments, often commented on how Rajan's recovery had changed her perspective on the animals they cared for.
"We always knew that animals had feelings,
She said one afternoon, watching Rajan interact with visitors.
but seeing how Rajan responded to Dr. Ananya's care, it's something else. It's like he needed someone who truly understood him. We all did what we could, but it was that connection with her that made the difference."
The zoo staff began to see their work in a new light. They realized that their role went beyond just feeding and cleaning up after the animals. It was about understanding the emotional and psychological needs of the creatures they cared for. Rajan's recovery had taught them the power of empathy, the importance of building trust, and the deep bond that could exist between humans and animals. It wasn't just about providing physical care. It was about offering emotional support, being present in ways that allowed the animals to heal at their own pace. As Rajan's recovery progressed, he became a symbol of resilience and healing. Visitors to the zoo began to take notice of his remarkable transformation. Families would often stop by his enclosure, watching in awe as Rajan interacted with Dr. Ananya or explored the space around him. His story was shared with guests, a reminder of the power of love and connection. Rajan's journey from illness and withdrawal to health and vitality became a source of inspiration for many. The zoo staff found themselves drawn to Rajan's story as well. It was a daily reminder that healing, both physical and emotional, takes time and patience. It wasn't just about providing for the elephants and other animals. They needed love and understanding too. Rajan had shown them that animals weren't just creatures to be cared for. They were individuals with their own personalities, memories, and emotions. Dr. Ananya's visits continued, but now they were filled with the shared joy of watching Rajan thrive. Their bond had evolved into something more profound than either could have expected. Rajan no longer needed to be coaxed to eat or encouraged to interact with others. His playful spirit had returned, and it was evident in every moment he shared with the people who had helped him heal. As the weeks passed, Rajan continued to grow stronger. His bond with Dr. Ananya remained unwavering, and the zoo staff came to see him as a symbol of the resilience and power of life. Rajan had found his way back, and in doing so, he had shown everyone around him that healing was possible, even in the darkest of times. His journey had been long, but it had led to a new beginning, a new chapter in his life and in the lives of those who cared for him. And as he wandered through the zoo once more, his playful steps echoing in the air, it was clear to all that Rajan had truly come home. Dr. Ananya stood at a distance, leaning against the railing of the observation deck as she watched Rajan interact with the zoo visitors. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden light over the zoo, and Rajan stood at the edge of his enclosure, his large ears flicking in the breeze. Children approached, their eyes wide with curiosity, and Rajan reached out with his trunk, gently touching the bars of the enclosure. There was no hesitation, no sign of the sadness that once clouded his eyes. Now there was only a quiet serenity in his movements, a calm that came from knowing he was no longer alone in his journey. Dr. Ananya felt a deep sense of gratitude as she watched Rajan's steady movements, his once sluggish steps now filled with purpose. He was no longer the broken, withdrawn elephant he had been when he first arrived at the zoo. He had healed, not just physically, but emotionally as well. The trauma he had endured, the distance from his past, and the uncertainty of his future had all been eased by the quiet power of love and care. Rajan had come to understand that healing didn't just happen in the body, it happened in the heart too. Rajan's calm demeanor was a testament to the strength of the bond they shared. He had learned to trust again, not just in Dr. Ananya, but in the world around him. His once tense body now exuded a sense of peace, as if he had found contentment in the present moment. There was no longer any sign of the despair that had clouded his early days at the zoo. He had found his place, both in the zoo and in his heart, a place of belonging, love, and quiet joy. As Dr. Ananya stood watching him, she knew that their journey together had come full circle. Their time apart had been long, but it had only deepened their bond. What they had shared, though sometimes unspoken, was a connection that had transcended the years. They had both changed, but their love for each other had remained constant, like an invisible thread that bound them together. In the final moments, as Rajan slowly turned to walk toward a shaded area in his enclosure, Dr. Ananya smiled softly to herself. She realized that the true power of healing had come not just from her care, but from the unspoken trust and connection they had built over the years. It was a reminder that love, in its purest form, had the power to heal even the deepest wounds. The story of Rajan's journey, his emotional despair, his slow but steady recovery, and his eventual peace, was a testament to the power of connection, of love, and of compassion. In the end, Rajan had found his peace, and in doing so, he had shown that healing could come not only from physical care, but from the lasting bonds that sustain us through our darkest times. Dr. Ananya turned to leave, knowing that Rajan was in good hands, surrounded by the care of those who understood his journey. But she also knew that no matter where her path led, the bond they shared would never be broken. It was a bond that would last, a bond that would always be there, like the steady heartbeat of the elephant who had taught her the true meaning of healing.